I stood at the far end of the oak table I had built with my husband's blistered hands, the scent of cinnamon and ham still heavy in the air. My son raised his glass, smiling for his friends. "Some people shouldn't even be at the table anymore," he said. Laughter. Crystal sharp, cutting through the room like ice. After 40 Christmases in this house, after feeding him through every loss and every triumph, I had become a guest at my own table. That night, in silence, I began taking it all back. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The snow outside fell in slow, steady flakes, softening the edges of the suburban cul-de-sac. Inside Carolyn Pierce's home, the warmth of Christmas dinner glowed from every corner, strings of white lights around the windows, candles flickering across the sideboard, a fire snapping in the stone hearth. The dining room smelled of roasted ham, pine needles, and cinnamon rolls that Riley had helped glaze that morning. At the center of it all stood Carolyn's table, solid oak, long enough to seat 16. Its grain polished by decades of elbows, plates, and laughter. She and her late husband had built it in their garage 40 years ago, sanding until their fingers blistered, varnishing until the whole house smelled of turpentine. It was more than furniture. It was witness. Family and neighbors filled every chair, chatter bouncing off the walls. Lindsay's laugh rang a little too sharp, like Crystal tapped too hard. Kyle sat at the head, chin lifted, as though the seat had always been his by right. Riley tucked herself between two cousins, her sketch pad hidden under the edge of her plate. Carolyn, as always, kept to the far end, her presence quiet, steady, unnoticed. Then Kyle rose with his glass, tapping the rim with a fork. "A toast," he announced. The room hushed, though Carolyn noticed Lindsay's friends leaned in eagerly, waiting for a performance. Kyle smirked. "To family," he began, then paused long enough for every eye to settle on him. "And to tradition, some traditions anyway. Not all of them are worth keeping. Some people," his gaze slid like a knife down the table, "shouldn't even be at the table anymore." The laughter was immediate, nervous, high-pitched from Lindsay's friends, indulgent from a couple of Kyle's co-workers who didn't know better. Lindsay covered her mouth in faux shock, then giggled behind her manicured fingers. Riley froze. She didn't look at her father, she looked at Carolyn. Wide-eyed, lips pressed tight, she lowered her head so her hair shadowed her face. The scrape of a fork against china seemed louder than the laughter. Carolyn blinked once, steady. She had been insulted before, overlooked, spoken over. But this was different. This was her home, her table, her husband's memory carved into every groove. The room's heat pressed against her chest until breathing hurt. She set down her fork with deliberate care. No one noticed the soft click of silver against porcelain. No one noticed her push back her chair. Only Riley's eyes followed her grandmother as she rose, gathered her plate, and walked the long stretch of oak step by step, as if carrying something fragile through a storm. No words, no anger, just silence. The laughter faltered slightly when she disappeared into the hallway. Kyle raised his glass higher, pretending nothing had shifted, but Riley caught the faint tremor in his hand. Carolyn's slippers whispered across the hardwood as she retreated down the hall, past the framed family photos, birthdays, graduations, every Christmas since 1982. At the end of the corridor, she opened her bedroom door. The air inside was cooler, untouched by the oven's heat and the crowd's breath. She set her half-eaten plate on the dresser, untouched ham congealing in its glaze. For a long moment she stood still, her pulse in her ears. The sound of voices muffled through the closed door, laughter and clinking glasses reduced to a distant hum, like another world. Then she crossed to the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. Her husband had built it the same year they built the table. She lowered herself to her knees, fingertips brushing the carved lid. The wood was smooth but nicked from years of use. She lifted the lid, and the scent of cedar rose like a memory of their garage, of sawdust and tobacco, and his steady whistle while he worked. Inside lay the things she had kept untouched: folded linens, a stack of letters in his handwriting, and a leather envelope bound with a faded ribbon. Documents, deeds, proof of ownership. She rested her palm over it, feeling the weight of paper that had outlasted his life, their marriage, and perhaps even the family that now laughed without her. Her throat tightened, but her hand steadied. The laughter down the hall rose again. A cheer this time. Kyle's voice booming over the others. For a moment Carolyn considered returning, walking back in, forcing her presence on the table he now claimed. But she stayed kneeling by the cedar chest, her fingers tightening around the leather envelope. "Not tonight," she whispered, almost to herself. The envelope slipped into her lap. She closed the lid, the soft thud sounding final, deliberate. Behind her, the bedroom door rattled faintly, as though a draft had passed through the house, or someone had brushed against it in the hallway. Carolyn stiffened, listening. The voices had grown fainter, but she knew one thing with startling clarity. Nothing in this house belonged to Kyle, not yet. And if he thought otherwise, she now had the proof to remind him. The leather envelope felt heavier than it should have, its edges worn soft from years inside the cedar chest. Carolyn carried it carefully to the desk by her window, the lamplight spilling over the papers as though they had been waiting for this night. Outside, the snow thickened, coating the cul-de-sac in white silence. Her hands trembled, not with weakness, but with memory. She slid out the first document, the familiar blue and white seal of Franklin County Probate Court. Deed of ownership. The address was hers. Her signature, neat and steady from a younger hand, stared back at her. She searched for the line she dreaded, the transfer clause Kyle had always spoken of as fact, but there was none. Carolyn sat straighter, her breath catching in her chest. Kyle had been wrong. No, not just wrong. He had assumed. All these years of hinting, of speaking as though the house had already passed to him, as though she were a guest in her own home, and he never once checked. The laughter from the dining room dimmed, then burst again, muffled through walls. But Carolyn no longer heard it the same. It wasn't a wall between them. It was paper. It was her name. The next morning, Marta arrived at Carolyn's back door, bundled in a red scarf and gloves that had seen better winters. She carried her usual thermos of coffee and 2 donuts from the corner bakery. When Carolyn laid the papers across the kitchen table, Marta didn't sit. She leaned over, glasses perched on her nose, scanning each line. "Well," Marta said finally, straightening with a grunt. "That changes the temperature, doesn't it?" Carolyn's lips curved in something between a smile and a grimace. "He thinks I'm clinging to the past. He doesn't know I was holding it for him." She touched the page, her finger resting on her signature. "At least I thought I was," Marta snorted, tugging her scarf loose. "You've been feeding that boy for 40 years, and he still thinks you owe him your bones? Please. Men like Kyle only respect what's nailed down in ink." She tapped the deed. "And honey, this is nailed down." Later that afternoon, Dale Horn walked into her living room, shaking the snow from his coat. Time had made his hair thinner, but not his presence. He had been at her husband's side during the building of that table, during the purchase of this very house. When Carolyn handed him the stack of documents, his eyes flickered with recognition before he even read a word. "Still in your name," Dale confirmed, voice steady, almost casual, as if he'd been expecting it. He flipped through page after page, nodding. "House, furnishings, the lot of it. Never transferred, which means—" He slid the papers back toward her, his gaze meeting hers with quiet weight. "You're the owner, full stop." Carolyn exhaled slowly, the tension leaving her shoulders like air from a balloon. He thought he already had it. Dale shook his head. "Thinking isn't owning." Carolyn stood, moving to the window where snow now buried the shrubs in white mounds. The laughter from the previous night echoed in her memory. Kyle's smug smile, Lindsay's giggles, Riley's downturned gaze. The sting was still there, but beneath it, something harder had formed. Resolve. "I want the will rewritten," she said, her voice low but clear. "Starting now." Dale arched a brow. "You sure you're ready for that conversation?" Carolyn turned from the window. "He told me I didn't belong at my own table. He thinks silence is surrender." Her fingers curled around the back of the chair. "It's not. Silence keeps records." Marta perched on the sofa with her thermos, raised it like a toast. "And records win wars." The room went quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. Dale slid the papers back into the envelope and tucked it under his arm. "I'll draft the changes tonight. It'll be filed before they even know to blink." Carolyn's gaze drifted again to the snowy street outside. Across the cul-de-sac, Kyle's SUV sat crooked in the driveway, the windshield frosting over. She imagined him walking in, smug from work, certain the house was his inheritance, his kingdom. But kingdoms could collapse, and this one would start with a single stroke of a pen. The pen hovered in her hand longer than it should have, not because she doubted, but because the act felt heavier than any holiday meal she had ever served. At the small desk in Dale's office, a converted room above a mid-tier law practice in downtown Columbus, Carolyn reread the draft one more time. Her name at the top, her signature line at the bottom, and between them, the words that would sever ties stronger than blood. Kyle's name neatly struck out. Her son would not inherit the house, or the furnishings, or the ground beneath the maple tree where he once played as a boy. Instead, the clauses now favored Riley. Education trust, character requirements, language Dale had suggested. Careful but firm. Carolyn had added her own in her slow, deliberate script. "The dining table, constructed by myself and my late husband, is not to be sold, inherited or touched by Kyle or Lindsay Pierce under any circumstance. It shall pass to Riley Pierce when she is of age, to remain in her possession for life." Her chest tightened, reading it back. The table was more than wood. It was the marrow of the family, and now it was written in ink that Kyle would never lay hands on it again. "Still want to sign?" Dale asked from across the desk. His voice carried no pressure, only steady patience, like someone who'd walked widows through harder nights. Carolyn pressed the pen to paper. "More than I wanted to eat that dinner." Her signature came out steady, not a tremor, not a pause. When it was done, Dale slid the document into a heavy folder and placed it into his briefcase. The soft click of the latch sounded like the shutting of a vault. By late afternoon, Carolyn was back at Marta's house. The kitchen smelled faintly of gingerbread and bleach, a combination only Marta could manage. Between them on the counters sat a small pile of Carolyn's heirlooms, her wedding band, her mother's brooch, a strand of pearls that had only ever come out at Christmas. "I don't want them in that house anymore," Carolyn said, wrapping tissue around each piece before laying it into Marta's tin bread box. "Not where they can rummage." Marta folded her arms, eyes sharp. "Good. You're not hiding, you're preserving. There's a difference." Carolyn added the folder of documents to the pile, her hand lingering on it for a moment. For years, she'd thought of the house as a gift she was holding on to for Kyle. Now every paper told her it had been hers all along. The next morning, Lindsay's voice rang out not in Carolyn's house, but across the neighborhood's scrolling feeds. A post, polished and smug, captioned under a glossy family photo at Christmas. "Family means loyalty." The comments piled up, hearts and affirmations from her friends, cooing at the image of togetherness. Carolyn read it once, her jaw tightening. Across the kitchen table, Marta peered over her glasses. "You gonna let that one slide?" Carolyn's lips curved into something colder than a smile. "If family means loyalty..." She pushed the phone back across the table. "Then they're not family." Marta's laugh was low and approving. "Amen." That evening, Carolyn stood again in her own hallway, the oak floors gleaming, the laughter of Christmas now only memory. Her hands brushed over the empty space where her jewelry box once sat, where framed photographs had been pulled from the walls, where silence seemed to echo. The house felt stripped but lighter, as though the weight of pretense had been carried out with the boxes. She paused at the dining room door, gazing at the long oak table. Its surface still bore faint scratches from Riley's crayons years ago, still carried the shine of wax polished by her late husband's hands. It stood waiting, proud and silent, as if it knew it had been rescued. Carolyn rested her palm flat against the wood. "You'll outlast them." Her voice didn't waver. From outside, headlights swept across the wall as Kyle's SUV pulled into the driveway. The engine cut, doors slammed, voices carried. Carolyn stayed where she was, hand pressed to the table, a soldier at her post. She didn't move to greet them, didn't reach for her coat, didn't prepare a meal. For the first time in 40 years, she would not be serving them dinner. And when Kyle came through the door, expecting his mother's silence to mean surrender, he would find something far sharper waiting in its place. The moving truck rumbled into the cul-de-sac on a Tuesday morning, its diesel engine cutting through the winter silence. Frost clung to the lawns, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. Carolyn stood on her front porch with her coat zipped tight and gloves folded neatly in her pocket, watching the men unload dollies and padded blankets. She had scheduled this moment down to the hour. Kyle at work, Riley at school, Lindsay still asleep in her silk robe somewhere in the back bedroom. No audience, no interruptions. "Start with the table," Carolyn said. The foreman glanced at the paperwork Dale had filed, her name, her authorization, her property. "Yes, ma'am." Inside, the house echoed with the scrape of heavy oak legs against polished wood floors. The men lifted the dining table, its weight enough to make one grunt, but they carried it carefully, reverently, as if even strangers understood what it meant to the woman standing silent at the doorframe. Carolyn followed them room to room, her instructions clipped and precise. The china cabinet next. Then the chairs, 12 of them, each one scraped and worn from decades of holiday meals. Then the rug beneath the table, rolled tight and bound with twine. The heart of the dining room dismantled piece by piece until the space yawned hollow, just hardwood and shadows where her family had once gathered. Across the street, Marta sat in her idling car with a thermos steaming in the cup holder. Her phone camera tracked every movement, every box, every polished chair leg disappearing into the truck's belly. She offered a little salute whenever Carolyn glanced her way, as if to remind her, "We document, we don't yell." By mid-morning, the house looked foreign. Without the furniture, it felt stripped bare. A stage waiting for a play that would never be performed again. Carolyn stood in the center of the empty dining room, the winter light falling across her face. She pressed her hand against the wall, steadying herself, then pulled a folded note from her coat pocket. Her handwriting was careful, deliberate. She pinned it with blue painter's tape directly where the china cabinet once stood. The words were simple. "Eat where you're welcome." The paper fluttered slightly in the draft, as if nodding in agreement. The first sound of Lindsay's return came hours later, the garage door groaning open, the echo of high heels on tile. Carolyn remained calm in the dining room, waiting. "Carolyn?" Lindsay's voice carried down the hall, sugared and shrill. "Why are there trucks out front?" A beat. Then, "Where's the furniture?" The click of heels quickened, then stopped short at the threshold. Lindsay froze, mascara smudged from sleep, silk robe tied crooked. Her eyes darted around the stripped room, disbelief clouding her face before outrage took over. "You can't just," she sputtered, pointing toward the truck outside, "take things out of this house without permission." Carolyn turned, her gloves in her hand. Her voice was calm, almost clinical. "It's my house. My permission." Lindsay's mouth opened, then snapped shut, fury and panic fighting for space. She looked to the wall, saw the taped note, and let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a choke. "You're insane," but Carolyn didn't argue. She simply stepped past her, coat zipped, gloves now on. At the doorway, she paused just long enough to look back at the hollow room, the winter sun gleaming across the bare floorboards. "It looks better this way," she said softly, and walked out. By dusk, Dale's office faxed confirmation. The updated filings had been logged with probate court. Property rights, asset lists, the new will, all now part of the public record. A digital stamp marked the date and time. Carolyn sat at Marta's kitchen table, sipping tea, listening to the printer hum. Each page stacked neatly before her was proof, not just of ownership, but of liberation. Marta slid one across the table toward her. "He's going to come home tonight and think he still has a kingdom." Carolyn's fingers tightened around the warm mug. Her voice was steady. "Then he's in for a surprise." Outside, the night deepened over Columbus, the snow thickening on empty driveways. And in one house across the cul-de-sac, Kyle Pierce would soon walk into a dining room gutted of history, a note fluttering on the wall where his mother's legacy had once stood. The garage door creaked open at 6:30, headlights washing across the frosted driveway. Kyle's SUV groaned to a stop, the music still pounding from the speakers as he climbed out with the swagger of a man certain the night was his to command. He tossed his coat over his shoulder, phone already in hand, and strode through the front door. "Linz," he called. The silence stopped him. He took 2 more steps, and then his eyes locked on the dining room. The room he'd grown up in was gone. No table, no chairs, no rug, just hardwood floor and a note taped to the wall like a punchline. He tore it down, scanning the words, "Eat where you're welcome." "What the hell?" his voice cracked. "Linz." But Lindsay wasn't in the room. She was upstairs, furiously typing into her phone. Mascara streaked down her cheeks. She didn't bother to answer. Kyle's pulse hammered. He marched toward the kitchen, still clutching the crumpled note, when his own phone buzzed with a new email notification. He swiped it open, irritation boiling into rage. The subject line stopped him cold. "Notice of estate modification. Pierce, Carolyn." He skimmed the first few lines, his mouth going dry. "Effective immediately, you are no longer beneficiary to the Pierce estate. All assets have been reassigned. Filed with Franklin County Probate Court, 12/28, 4:13 p.m. Kyle read it twice, his chest tightening, then scrolled down to the attached PDF. Page after page of legalese, signatures, notarizations, clauses, and his name erased. No. He backed against the counter, his hand gripping the marble edge so hard his knuckles blanched. She wouldn't. But she had. He stabbed Dale Horn's number with his thumb, pacing furiously as the line rang. Straight to voicemail. He tried again, louder this time, shouting into the phone. "Dale, you better call me back right now. This is a mistake, and you know it. She's old. She doesn't know what she's doing. You're taking advantage of her." The beep cut him off. He hurled the phone onto the counter, the email still glowing. For the first time in years, Kyle felt the ground beneath him tilt. That night, across the cul-de-sac, Riley slipped out of her parents' house with her sketch pad hugged to her chest. The snow crunched under her boots as she crossed to her grandmother's porch. Carolyn was waiting in the doorway with the porch light on, a wool blanket draped around her shoulders. Riley's breath came in puffs, her eyes wide, full of words she hadn't spoken. "I didn't laugh," she said quickly, the moment she stepped inside. "I never laughed. When Dad made the toast, I didn't." Carolyn's chest ached, the dam inside her breaking. She wrapped Riley in her arms, pulling her close. "I know," she whispered into the girl's hair. "You were the only one who looked at me like I still mattered." Riley clung to her, silent tears soaking Carolyn's sweater. For the first time since Christmas night, Carolyn felt something fierce and certain, a bond stronger than signatures or deeds. She had lost a son, maybe for good. But in Riley, she had not been erased. 2 days later, the movers returned, not to her old house this time, but to a secure storage facility outside Columbus. Carolyn stood on the icy pavement, hands tucked in her pockets, watching as the oak table was carried into the unit. The men wrapped it carefully in padded blankets, strapped it tight, and wheeled it behind a heavy steel door. The foreman handed her the key. "No one touches it without you," Carolyn nodded, her fingers curling around the cool brass. "That's the point." The lock clicked shut with finality, echoing through the metal corridor. The table was safe now, safe from Lindsay's ambition, from Kyle's entitlement, from anyone who thought legacy was theirs to claim. Back at Marta's kitchen, Carolyn sat by the window while Marta scrolled through her phone, reading aloud the latest whispers from neighbors' group chats. Words like betrayal and ungrateful flared across the screen, mostly fueled by Lindsay's online theatrics. Carolyn didn't flinch. Instead, she traced the outline of Riley's latest drawing, a rough sketch of a tree, roots thick and sprawling, a single chair drawn beneath its branches. Marta set her phone down, eyes narrowing. He's going to lose his mind when he realizes it's not just the furniture. It's everything. Carolyn folded the drawing and slipped it into her pocket. Her voice was quiet, but her eyes were steel. "Let him?" Outside, across the cul-de-sac, lights still burned in Kyle's house. His SUV sat crooked in the driveway, its windshield frosted over, its owner pacing behind dark windows, clutching a piece of paper that told him the truth for the first time. The legacy he thought was his had never been his at all. The waiting room of Dale Horn's law office smelled faintly of stale coffee and printer ink. Carolyn sat across from him at the wide oak desk, the very same one Dale had leaned on when her husband first signed the original will decades ago. This time, the papers between them were far less forgiving. "Notarized, medical clearance, and timeline," Dale said, tapping the stack. "Everything tied in a bow. There isn't a judge in Franklin County who'll doubt you're of sound mind." Carolyn adjusted her reading glasses, scanning each page as though the letters themselves were bricks she was stacking into a wall. Every signature she added was another lock on the door Kyle thought he'd already kicked open. Dale pushed the last page toward her. "This one ensures there's no ambiguity about the dining table. It's listed separately, codified. If he tries to contest ownership, he won't just lose, he'll embarrass himself." Carolyn signed with deliberate calm. Her pen strokes were steady, the sound of ink scratching paper louder than her heartbeat. That evening, Marta brewed strong coffee and set a slice of pie in front of Carolyn. She studied her friend with sharp eyes. "You didn't even raise your voice when Lindsay came stomping through your dining room. You just left her with that note." Carolyn sipped the coffee, lips barely curling. "Why should I raise my voice? Silence keeps records." Marta leaned back in her chair, a slow grin spreading. "And now those records are stamped, filed, notarized. He's walking into a storm he doesn't even see coming." The storm arrived faster than either of them expected. Within days, Kyle filed a petition with the county court, claiming undue influence, citing his mother's age, suggesting senility. The paperwork hit Dale's office like a predictable script. But Dale was ready. He had prepared the countermeasures before Kyle ever dialed his number in rage. Carolyn's physician's affidavit of full mental capacity, the notarizations, the timeline of her decisions. Every safeguard tucked neatly into place. When the pretrial review convened in a sterile courtroom downtown, Kyle showed up with a new suit and a smirk, Lindsay at his side. Carolyn sat 3 rows back beside Marta, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She didn't flinch as Kyle's attorney droned on about manipulation, elder abuse, irrational behavior. Dale rose with his file and presented the paperwork like a surgeon laying out clean instruments. Every argument Kyle's attorney raised was cut apart piece by piece. The judge barely looked up when he dismissed the challenge. Petition denied, all filings stand. The gavel cracked. Kyle blinked, as though he hadn't heard correctly. His jaw tightened, face flushing red, a vein in his temple pulsing. Lindsay tried to tug at his sleeve, but he yanked his arm away. His humiliation wasn't private. The dismissal was public record, accessible to anyone curious enough to type his name into the county database. In the back row, Marta whispered to Carolyn. "He came to take your crown and left with egg on his face." Carolyn didn't smile. She simply gathered her coat, her silence louder than any gloating. That night, back at her condo, Carolyn found an envelope slipped under her door. She bent to pick it up, her heart tightening. Kyle again? Another threat? But when she opened it, her breath caught. Inside was a drawing, a long oak table, carefully sketched in pencil. At the head of it sat not Kyle, but her. Riley had drawn her grandmother with a calm, steady expression, shoulders square, hands folded gently as though blessing the meal. Underneath, Riley had written in looping cursive, "The real head of the table." Carolyn pressed the paper to her chest, her throat thickening. For years she had given silently, endured quietly, hosted without thanks. Now her granddaughter had seen her, truly seen her, in the place she belonged. Outside, snow fell steadily against the window pane, blanketing the city in silence. Carolyn sat at her desk, Riley's drawing before her, while across town, Kyle poured whiskey into a glass, his search history betraying his desperation. How to overturn a will. The letterhead gleamed under Dale's desk lamp, his pen scratching steadily across the page. "This language leaves no room for argument," he muttered as he worked. Carolyn sat across from him, her posture straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. The office was hushed except for the whisper of pen on paper and the hum of the radiator. "Cease and desist," Dale said finally, sliding the first draft toward her. "Both Kyle and Lindsay, they are barred from entering your residence, contacting your bank, attempting to harass your counsel. Signed, notarized, enforceable. If they so much as breathe near your property, they'll find themselves in contempt." Carolyn picked up the document, her eyes scanning the black print. She didn't blink, didn't hesitate. "Send them." Dale studied her. No hesitation, not even with Riley in their house? Her hand tightened on the paper. "No visits, no exceptions, no guilt. I'll protect her in my way, and she'll know exactly why." Her voice didn't waver. It was the sound of granite closing over a grave. Later that evening, Carolyn sat in Marta's kitchen, the smell of roasted chicken drifting from the oven. Marta set 2 plates on the table, then leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "So," Marta said, her eyes narrowed with approval, "you've shut the doors, bolted the locks, thrown the papers in their faces. Now what are you going to do?" Carolyn speared a carrot, chewed slowly, then set down her fork. Her gaze lifted, firm, almost defiant. "Live. Loudly." Marta barked out a laugh. "Now that's the woman I know." The next morning, Carolyn drove into downtown Columbus, her coat collar turned against the winter wind. She parked outside the modest brick building that housed the Mid-Ohio Food Collective. The air inside smelled faintly of coffee, industrial floor cleaner, and hope. She walked to the front desk, carrying a sealed envelope. "This," she told the director, her voice soft but steady, "is in memory of my husband, Daniel Pierce. He believed no table should ever be empty." The director opened the envelope, blinked at the check inside, and looked back at her, speechless. $50,000. Enough to keep shelves stocked and families fed through the harshest months. Carolyn signed the donation form with the same steady hand she'd used on the will. Her legacy wasn't confined to a deed or a table. It was alive, nourishing, impossible for Kyle or Lindsay to poison. As she left, she caught her reflection in the glass door. Her scarf was snug around her neck, her shoulders squared. For the first time in years, she looked less like a widow and more like a woman writing her own chapters. That afternoon, she sat at her desk in the condo, laptop open, cursor blinking on a blank Facebook post. She wasn't one for public declarations. Decades of her life had been lived in quiet margins, but tonight felt different. Tonight, silence would not mean invisibility. Her fingers typed slowly, deliberately. "In memory of Daniel Pierce, I've made a donation to the Mid-Ohio Food Collective. He always said no table should be without bread. And to my granddaughter Riley, Thank you for never looking away. She attached a photo Riley had drawn last year, one of Carolyn sitting on the porch with her knitting, Riley curled beside her sketching. The image radiated warmth. She hit post. The responses flooded in quickly. Neighbors, old church friends, even former co-workers she hadn't seen in decades. Words of admiration, stories about Daniel, praise for Riley. The ripple traveled farther than she'd expected, wider than Kyle's smug social media posts ever had. Across the cul-de-sac, Lindsay's shrill voice carried through frosted windows. She scrolled furiously on her phone, watching Carolyn's post gather likes, comments, admiration that should have been theirs to command. Kyle sat slumped at the kitchen counter, whiskey glass in hand, eyes dark. This is what she's doing now? Lindsay spat. Parading around like a saint while we're left out? Kyle didn't answer, his jaw clenched, his gaze fixed on the note still crumpled on the counter. Eat where you're welcome. The silence stretched, sharp and dangerous. Back in her condo, Carolyn logged off, closed the laptop, and looked out at the snow falling steady over the city. For the first time in years, she felt not erased, but amplified. She had chosen her stage, but as she turned to make tea, she didn't notice the envelope that had been slid under her door, its edge just visible against the rug. The envelope was thin, cheap paper, the kind sold in bulk. But the handwriting carved across its front was sharp, deliberate, her name written like a threat. Carolyn carried it unopened to Dale's office the next morning, her gloves still damp from melted snow. Don't look at it alone, Marta had warned. So she hadn't. Dale slit the envelope with a letter opener, his jaw tightening as he unfolded the single page. The scrawl was jagged, furious. You've made your point, but you won't win. You're nothing without us. Dale laid the paper flat, then tapped the signature flourish at the bottom, an initial more than a name. Not Kyle, Lindsay. This is her handwriting. Carolyn stared at the lines, her pulse steady. She wasn't afraid. If anything, she felt confirmation bloom inside her chest, like a gavel striking down. She doesn't realize, Carolyn said quietly, that every letter is a record, and records build cases. Dale nodded. I'll have it logged. Keep it cataloged, in case she's foolish enough to send another. That evening, Carolyn stopped by a hardware store and bought 4 boxed security cameras. Back at the condo, Marta helped her climb a step stool, holding steady as Carolyn installed them at each corner, entryway, balcony, hallway, garage. When they finished, Marta wiped her hands on her coat and gave a firm nod. Smile for the cameras, Lindsay, she muttered. Carolyn managed the faintest smile. Let her try. Days passed, the snow outside turning gray and heavy at the curbs. Riley's secret messages became Carolyn's light in the dark. Each night, tucked under her blanket, Carolyn opened her phone to find photos Riley had quietly snapped. Her parents' kitchen counters bare, takeout boxes stacked in the trash, her father's glass of whiskey perpetually half full. One picture showed Riley's room stripped of its posters, her backpack shoved in the corner. They're mad all the time, Riley had typed in the caption. Dad slams doors. Mom says you poisoned everything. Carolyn's heart ached. She typed back only 3 words. You are safe. And then she called Dale. Update the will again, she said, her voice sharp, decisive. Riley's educational trust, fully funded. You're sure? He asked. I won't leave her to their anger, Carolyn said. Not a penny will pass through Kyle's hands. If she wants to go to college, if she wants to make a life beyond their bitterness, she'll have the means. Dale didn't argue. He knew better. 2 mornings later, her phone rang with a call flagged from her bank's security line. The representative's voice was polite, rehearsed. Mrs. Pierce, we've had a party contact us asking about your balances, your activity. They claim to be your daughter-in-law. Carolyn closed her eyes, exhaling through her nose. And did you give her anything? No, ma'am. We followed procedure, denied access, but we thought you should know. Thank you, Carolyn said crisply. She hung up and dialed back within the hour, alerting the fraud department. locking every account with new authorizations and passwords. She set alerts on her phone, two-factor security on every login. When she was done, she sat at her desk, her fingers pressed against Riley's drawing, the one where Carolyn sat at the head of the table. The pencil lines seemed stronger now, bolder, as though Riley had drawn her not as a grandmother, but as a sentinel. Across town, Lindsay was pacing in her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, her voice raised, desperate. "She blocked me from the bank. She shut me out everywhere. Kyle, do something." Kyle didn't answer. He only stared at the empty dining room, the blank floorboards, his fist tightening around the crumpled note that had never stopped mocking him. Back in the condo, Carolyn shut her blinds, the cameras blinking red as they recorded the quiet stillness. She poured herself tea, her body calm, her mind sharp. The phone buzzed again, another notification, another attempt, this time from a different number, unknown, masked. Carolyn silenced the call. She wasn't rattled, but when she set her phone back on the counter, she caught the faint shadow of movement on the live camera feed above her door. A figure had paused in the hallway, just long enough to look directly into the lens before vanishing down the stairwell. Dale slid the file across his desk with the same precision he might use to hand over a loaded weapon. Carolyn opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the stamped documents, the official seals. "Clean," Dale said. "Recorded yesterday. The house is no longer tied in any way to Kyle's name. Truth is, it never was. He assumed. He built a whole castle in his head on sand." Carolyn traced her finger across the line that mattered most. Sole owner, Carolyn Pierce. Her pulse didn't race this time. It steadied, like her heart had been waiting for this exact rhythm. "Now," Dale continued, leaning back in his chair, "he'll get the notice. Property taxes, backdated fees. And unless he wants to pack his boxes, he'll be signing a lease with you in the next 30 days. Carolyn folded the file shut. "Lease it back or leave it." "Exactly." The notice arrived at Kyle's house 2 mornings later, tucked among the usual junk mail and glossy mortgage flyers he used to toss aside without reading. But this envelope was heavy, government-stamped, the kind that tightened a man's stomach before it was even opened. He ripped it apart at the kitchen counter, Lindsay peering over his shoulder. "What is it?" His eyes darted down the page, each line sinking like lead. Property reassessment, unpaid legal fees, proof of sole ownership under Carolyn Pierce, a lease agreement, 30 days. This has to be a mistake," Kyle muttered, his voice strangled. "Rent?" Lindsay's laugh was high-pitched, desperate. "In our own house? She's charging us rent?" Kyle crumpled the page in his fist, pacing the length of the kitchen, his jaw locked. For years he'd told himself he was the head of the Pierce estate, the inheritor, the man in control. And now, in black and white, he was nothing more than a tenant. Across the cul-de-sac, Carolyn received a voicemail from Riley, her granddaughter's voice hushed but urgent. "They're blaming you for everything. Dad says you tricked him. Mom says you're just jealous. They fight every night. I stay in my room, but I hear it all." Carolyn closed her eyes, the words pressing like stones against her chest. She replayed the message once more, then set the phone down. Marta was perched across the table, sipping her coffee. "That cut deep?" "No," Carolyn said, her voice low, firm. "Let them blame me. Blame doesn't hold up in court." Marta smiled faintly. "Amen to that." That evening, as the snow fell thick against her condo windows, Carolyn's phone buzzed again, a text this time, from Kyle. Where blood, she stared at the words, the arrogance of them, the entitlement. As if blood were a crown, as if family ties erased everything he had done. Carolyn typed back, her fingers steady on the screen. "So is Rust." She hit send and set the phone face down on the table. For a long moment, she simply sat in silence, the clock ticking on the wall, the cameras blinking red above her door. She thought of Riley's drawing, her granddaughter's pencil lines sketching her at the head of the table, and she thought of Kyle, pacing in an empty dining room, clutching bills he had no idea how to pay. This wasn't revenge, she realized. This was correction, a rebalancing of weight. The ledger was being written clean, line by line. Across town, Kyle slammed his phone onto the counter so hard the screen cracked, his breath ragged. Lindsay shrieked at him, demanding solutions, demanding explanations, but Kyle had no words left. His kingdom had been paper thin, and his mother had pulled every page out from under him. Through the frost-streaked window of his empty dining room, the cul-de-sac lights glowed faintly. Across the way, Carolyn's condo stood quiet, her silhouette visible against the lamp in her window, watching, waiting, unmoved. Kyle's fist clenched. He wasn't finished. Not yet. Snow clung to the corners of the courthouse steps, the salt leaving streaks of white across the stone. Carolyn climbed slowly, her gloved hand trailing the cold railing. Dale walked beside her, the manila folder tucked under his arm like a shield. "This won't be contested at first," he said. "We'll file for partial guardianship, educational and financial care. It gives Riley structure without outright removing her from their custody. A soft opening." Carolyn adjusted her scarf, her voice steady. Soft openings still let the light in. Inside, the clerk's office was fluorescent and sterile. Dale laid the documents across the counter. Affidavits, notarizations, proof of Carolyn's financial stability. The clerk stamped each page with an indifferent thud. With every mark of the seal, Carolyn felt the paper lift weight from Riley's shoulders and settle onto hers instead. When the folder snapped shut, Dale gave her a nod. "It's official. We've opened the door." 2 weeks later, that door opened again. But this time, it was the entrance to Carolyn's condo. The snow had melted into slush on the walkways, and Riley stood on the threshold with her backpack slung over one shoulder, sketchpad hugged tightly to her chest. She didn't say a word, just stepped inside when Carolyn motioned her through. Marta carried the box of books behind them, muttering, "This girl's got more notebooks than clothes." Carolyn led Riley to the spare bedroom she'd prepared. Fresh linens on the bed, a small desk by the window, a lamp with a soft glow. It wasn't grand, but it was hers. Riley placed her sketch pad on the desk, her hand resting on it like a claim. "This okay?" Carolyn asked gently. Riley nodded once. "It feels quiet." Carolyn smoothed the blanket. "Quiet can be good." That night, the condo felt different. The hush was no longer emptiness, but peace. No raised voices through walls. No sharp laughter meant to wound. Just the sound of Riley's pencil scratching across paper. Carolyn's kettle whistling softly. Marta dropping by with a casserole, big enough to feed an army, as she declared. Carolyn sat in the living room, watching Riley curl into the corner of the couch, sketchpad balanced on her knees. The girl's shoulders, always tense around her parents, seemed to drop inch by inch, as if safety had weight and she could finally set it down. The drawing appeared on Carolyn's nightstand 2 mornings later. At first she thought Riley had forgotten her sketchpad there, but when she opened it, the page inside was deliberate. A tree, sprawling and strong, its roots deep and shaded. At the base, Riley had written Pierce family, but the branches were different. There were no names scrawled beside Kyle or Lindsay. Instead, the thickest branch stretched toward Carolyn, her name written bold at the trunk's heart. Beneath it, in smaller script, Riley had drawn a simple caption. "You're my real home." Carolyn sat on the edge of the bed, the page trembling in her hands. Tears welled hot and unstoppable, sliding down her cheeks, dripping onto the paper until the ink blurred. For all the deeds and wills and legal filings, nothing felt as binding as those 4 words in Riley's handwriting. She pressed the drawing to her chest, whispering into the quiet room, "You're mine too." That evening, Carolyn cooked dinner, simple roasted chicken with potatoes, and Riley set the table, humming softly under her breath. Marta joined them, clinking glasses of iced tea. For the first time in years, Carolyn felt a table filled not with entitlement, but with belonging. The cameras blinked red over the doorway, silent sentinels. The snow fell quietly against the window, and in the glow of the lamp, Riley smiled. Not guarded, not small, but free. Carolyn reached across the table, squeezing her granddaughter's hand. But in the shadows of the cul-de-sac, Kyle sat in his SUV, headlights off, engine idling. His face glowed faint in the dashboard light, eyes fixed on the windows of the condo across the way. Watching. Waiting. The family court smelled of old carpet and disinfectant, the kind of place where futures were decided in plain rooms without grandeur. Carolyn sat at the petitioner's table, Dale beside her, his files stacked like a fortress. Across the aisle, Kyle and Lindsay slouched in their chairs, their lawyer whispering frantically as if sheer volume could make up for thin arguments. Riley sat in the gallery with Marta, her sketchpad clutched to her chest, wide eyes darting between her parents and her grandmother. "All rise," the bailiff called. The judge entered, robes trailing, expression stern but tired. He didn't look like a man swayed by charm. Carolyn drew strength from that. The proceedings began. Kyle's lawyer painted a portrait of a confused old woman, manipulated by friends, poisoning family bonds. Mrs. Pierce is attempting to dismantle a home, he argued. She's using wealth and influence to alienate a child from her natural parents. Carolyn stayed still, hands folded, face calm. Dale rose. "Your Honor," he began, sliding a stack of documents forward. "The child in question has reached out to my client repeatedly. We present transcripts of voice messages, photographs sent secretly, and letters she's written, each one describing the volatile and unsafe conditions at her parents' home." The judge adjusted his glasses, scanning the evidence. Carolyn's heart beat steady, though her palms dampened. Every word Riley had whispered to her was now on record. Her granddaughter's voice, trembling but truthful. "They're mad all the time. Dad slams doors. Mom says you poisoned everything." The judge leaned back. Do the respondents wish to challenge the authenticity? Kyle stiffened, but Lindsay lurched forward, her voice pitched and sharp. "She's lying. She's a child. She doesn't know what she's saying." Carolyn put her up to this, just like she put her up to drawing those stupid pictures. "Mrs. Pierce," the judge warned. But Lindsay kept going, her words tumbling faster, more erratic. "She's trying to buy Riley, bribing her with money, notebooks, whatever she wants. You think Carolyn's a saint? She's a manipulator, a bitter old woman who can't stand not being the center of attention." The courtroom stilled. Even Kyle looked away, his face pinched with embarrassment. Carolyn didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence carried more weight than Lindsay's shrieks. Dale simply set Riley's drawing on the evidence table, Carolyn at the head of the oak table, calm and strong. The judge studied it a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm. "The evidence demonstrates an unstable home environment and clear attempts by the petitioner to provide stability and structure. Partial guardianship is granted to Mrs. Pierce. She will have educational and financial care during the school year." The gavel cracked. For a heartbeat, Carolyn couldn't move. Then Riley bolted from the gallery, throwing her arms around her grandmother's waist. "You heard him," she sobbed into Carolyn's coat. "He said yes. He said yes." Carolyn held her tightly, burying her face in the girl's hair. "I know, sweetheart. I know." From behind them, Lindsay hissed something venomous. But Marta intercepted, her hand clamping on Lindsay's arm with surprising force. "Sit down before you make a bigger fool of yourself," she whispered. Kyle didn't move. His head hung low, jaw clenched, as if the courtroom itself had rejected him. Carolyn drew back, wiping Riley's tears with her gloved thumb. The girl's eyes shone, red-rimmed but relieved. "You just adopted your future," Marta murmured from behind them, her voice low but full of pride. Carolyn looked at Riley, at the strength blooming in her small frame, and thought, no. She adopted me, too. Outside, the courthouse steps glistened with slush. Reporters weren't there yet, but neighbors whispered. The ruling was already spreading. Carolyn had won. But as they stepped into the cold air, Carolyn caught sight of Kyle across the street. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't storming. He was staring at her with a look she had never seen before. Quiet, calculating, dangerous. The community center in Columbus had never looked so alive. Strings of soft white lights looped along the rafters. Tables covered in crisp linen. The scent of roasted turkey and buttered rolls wafting through the air. The annual neighborhood dinner was usually modest, but this year felt different. There was a hum in the room, a collective awareness that something larger was being acknowledged. At the center of the hall stood a long table, brand new, the wood polished to a mirror shine. Its edges curved with the same grace as the one Carolyn and Daniel had built decades ago, though this one bore a brass plaque at its side. In honor of Carolyn Pierce, for decades of service, strength, and community. Carolyn paused when she saw it, her hand lifting to her mouth. For a moment she couldn't move. Marta nudged her from behind. "Well," she whispered, "they finally put your name where it belongs, on the head of the table." Riley tugged Carolyn forward, her face lit with a pride that made her look older than 16. She slid into the seat beside her grandmother, the two of them framed by the new oak like it had been waiting for them all along. Neighbors filled the room, laughter echoing, the scrape of chairs and clink of silverware creating a music far warmer than the silence of courtroom halls. People approached Carolyn with hugs, stories, even tears. One woman clasped her hands and said, "Your food kept us going the year my husband lost his job. I never forgot." Carolyn listened, humbled, her chest tightening with something she hadn't felt in years. Not victory, not defiance, but belonging. When the speeches began, Dale was the first to step up to the microphone. His voice, usually so plain and businesslike, carried an unexpected weight. "She served her family," he said simply, gesturing toward Carolyn. "And when her family turned away, she served her strength. Not everyone has the courage to do both." Applause broke out, the kind that rolled through the room like a tide. Carolyn blinked rapidly, her throat thick. She glanced at Riley, who squeezed her hand under the table. It was Carolyn's turn next. She rose slowly, the chair legs scraping against the polished floor. Every eye in the room turned toward her. She gripped the microphone, the metal cool in her hand, her heart pounding louder than the chatter had been moments earlier. "I don't have many words," she began, her voice softer than she intended. "But I have gratitude. To this community, to my friends who stood with me when silence seemed easier, and to the granddaughter who reminded me that quiet doesn't mean invisible." Her gaze swept the crowd, settling on Riley, whose eyes shone. "This table," Carolyn continued, touching the polished wood, "is more than furniture. It's a place to belong, a place to serve, and to be seen. Tonight, I feel both." She lowered the microphone, and for a moment the room was hushed. Then applause roared again, louder this time, echoing against the rafters until Carolyn felt her cheeks warm. Marta raised her glass high, her voice ringing out over the clamor, "To the woman who rebuilt the table." Glasses clinked in unison. Carolyn sat down, her shoulders light, her hand trembling slightly as Riley leaned into her side. For a brief moment, peace settled over her. She could almost believe the war outside these walls had ended. That Kyle's glare on the courthouse steps, Lindsay's shrill denials, the shadow that had lingered outside her condo, were nothing more than fading storms. But as she looked across the crowd, she caught sight of a face near the back, half hidden, just long enough to vanish when her eyes focused. The shape of the shoulders was too familiar, the tilt of the head too sharp. Her breath caught. "Kyle?" She blinked, but the space was empty again. Only the lingering chill across her skin reminded her that battles didn't end with applause. They only changed their arenas. Snow dusted the roof of the community center, glittering under streetlights like sugared frosting. Inside, warmth radiated from the kitchen, where volunteers carried trays of steaming potatoes, glazed carrots, and pies that fogged the windows with their sweetness. The room buzzed with laughter, coats piled in the corner, the clatter of cutlery punctuated by bursts of children's chatter. Carolyn stood near the new oak table at the center of it all, her hands smoothing the linen runners that stretched its length. It gleamed under the glow of pendant lights, almost identical to the one she and Daniel had built so many years ago. The same sturdy lines, the same deep grain of oak. She laid her hand flat against it and whispered to herself, "You'd like this one, Daniel. It's holding them too." Riley bounded up beside her, cheeks flushed from darting between guests with a tray of rolls. "It feels different here," she said, looking around at the crowded hall. "Like everybody belongs." Carolyn touched her shoulder. "That's because they do." The dinner rolled on in waves of warmth. Volunteers ladled soup, children carried plates to older neighbors, and strangers clinked glasses as though they'd known each other for years. The air smelled of nutmeg and roasted meat, underlined by pine garlands draped across the rafters. No one complained about portions. No one demanded better seats. When it was time for music, Marta nudged Riley forward with the guitar slung across her shoulder. Carolyn's eyebrows rose in surprise. Riley flushed but didn't resist. She climbed onto the low stage, strummed a few tentative chords, then leaned into the microphone. "This is for my grandmother," she said, her voice trembling but sure. "The woman who never left me standing." Carolyn's breath caught in her throat. The first notes rang soft and clear, a melody Riley must have practiced in secret. Her voice, young but strong, carried through the room, threading between tables and over laughter. Guests hushed, forks paused midair, conversations faded. All eyes turned to the girl singing from her heart. When the last chord hung in the air, silence lingered, then applause erupted, filling the rafters with claps and whistles. Carolyn pressed her hand to her lips, tears warming her eyes. Riley stepped down and went straight to her, folding into her arms. "You were perfect," Carolyn whispered. "You're why," Riley murmured back. Near the back of the hall, a reporter adjusted her camera and snapped photos of the crowd, of Carolyn holding Riley by the new oak table. Later, she pulled Carolyn aside, microphone raised. "Mrs. Pierce, you've become something of a symbol here. Strength, generosity, resilience. What does tonight mean to you?" Carolyn straightened, her hand still trembling slightly from Riley's song. She looked into the camera, voice steady. "It means a table can hold more than plates. It can hold love, belonging, and the kind of family you choose. Tonight isn't about me. It's about what happens when people are welcome." The reporter smiled. "Beautifully said." Hours later, as the segment aired on the local evening news, a different room heard those words. A cramped rental apartment on the edge of Columbus. The carpet worn, the blinds cheap plastic, the hum of a faulty heater in the corner. Kyle sat hunched on the couch, remote slack in his hand, a glass of whiskey sweating on the coffee table. The television glowed with Carolyn's face, her calm voice, Riley's song echoing from the speakers. Beside him, Lindsay scrolled furiously on her phone, comments and likes flying past on the station's Facebook page. Inspiring. Beautiful family. Strong grandmother. Each word stabbed like a blade. "This should have been us," she snapped, throwing the phone onto the couch. "She stole everything. Our house, our daughter, now even the damn spotlight." Kyle didn't answer, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the screen as Carolyn rested her hand on the new oak table, Riley glowing at her side. For the first time, he looked less like a man betrayed and more like a man hollowed out. Back at the community center, the hall emptied slowly. Carolyn lingered at the table, her hand tracing its polished surface. The wood felt alive under her palm, as if it carried her and Daniel's history forward. She looked around at the now quiet room, plates stacked, chairs tucked in. She smiled. Not the smile of survival, but of ownership, not of things, but of meaning. But outside, snow swirled under the streetlight. Across the parking lot, a figure leaned against a dark sedan, half shrouded in shadow, unmoving, watching the building as the last lights dimmed inside. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped into her condo mailbox between a grocery flyer and a utility bill. Carolyn turned it over in her hands as she walked back upstairs, noting the shaky handwriting on the front. Kyle's. Her first instinct was to throw it away unopened, but curiosity, habit maybe, got the better of her. She slid it open with a butter knife at her kitchen counter, unfolding the lined paper inside. The words sprawled across the page were messy, uneven, as though written in one sitting, glass in hand. Mom, I don't know where things went wrong. I know I said things I shouldn't have, and maybe I didn't appreciate everything you did. I just want us to move past all this. Riley needs her father, and I need my mother. We're still family. I'm sorry if I made you feel unwanted. Let's find a way back. Kyle. Carolyn read it once, not twice. Her eyes scanned the words like one might skim the label on a bottle already emptied. Too vague, too late. Apologies without specifics were just smoke, thin, disappearing the moment you tried to hold them. She folded the letter neatly, walked to the fireplace, and set it among the kindling. The flames caught quickly, curling the edges black, turning Kyle's plea into ash. She watched until the last flicker consumed his signature. Behind her, Riley's voice broke the silence. Do you ever miss them? Carolyn turned, startled. Riley stood in the doorway, hair messy from sleep, clutching her sketch pad against her chest. Her eyes weren't accusatory, just searching, heavy with the kind of question no child should have to carry. Carolyn moved to the couch and sat, patting the cushion beside her. Riley lowered herself slowly, still hugging the sketch pad. I don't miss them, Carolyn said at last, choosing each word carefully. I miss who I hoped they'd become, the people they could have been, if they'd chosen better. Riley nodded, her throat working as she tried to swallow. Her pencil tapped against the edge of the sketch pad. That's what I thought. Carolyn wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. Riley leaned into her, silent. Together they watched the fire die down, the last scraps of Kyle's letter turning into soft gray curls. Later that afternoon, Dale stopped by with the final paperwork for her estate. His briefcase clicked open, pages spread across her dining table. The condo's smaller one, not Daniel's oak. Last round, he said, his tone gentle. Once you sign these, the will is sealed. No more revisions unless you want them. Carolyn settled her glasses on her nose, the weight of the pen familiar now. She signed steadily, line after line, each stroke of ink like setting bricks in a wall no one could knock down. Dale pointed to one section. And here, the dining table clause, still intact. It passes only to Riley, explicit exclusion of Kyle and Lindsay. Carolyn pressed the nib of the pen to paper, her voice firm. It stays. That table belongs to Riley, and Riley alone. The clause gleamed on the page, more binding than any bloodline. When the last signature dried, Dale closed the folder. That's it. Your legacy is protected. Carolyn exhaled, long and steady. Good. Then it settled. That evening, Carolyn sat by the window while Riley worked at her desk, sketching under the lamplight. Outside, snow fell in lazy flakes, muffling the city. The condo smelled faintly of wood smoke, a reminder of the letter now gone. Carolyn thought of the brass plaque at the community center, of Riley's song, of the oak table locked in storage, safe, waiting. Her legacy wasn't just ink on paper. It was here, breathing beside her, pencil scratching against the page, humming softly. Yet as the fire settled into embers, Carolyn felt a chill brush her skin, the kind that came not from weather but from knowing a storm wasn't finished. Kyle's letter had burned, but his shadow still lingered. And shadows, she knew, had a way of knocking at doors long after the locks were turned. The snow on Christmas morning was the kind Daniel always loved best. Soft, steady, blanketing the streets in a hush that felt like reverence. Sunlight streamed through the condo's windows, catching in the frost, painting the room with a quiet glow. Carolyn stood in the kitchen, smoothing her apron. The scents of her old recipes filled the air: cinnamon, rosemary, the savory weight of ham warming in the oven. She plated fruit into a simple ceramic bowl, her movements unhurried. This year wasn't about spectacle, it was about presence. In the dining room, the oak table, retrieved from storage just a week earlier, waited, dressed simply. A linen cloth draped its length, sprigs of rosemary scattered down the center. No towering centerpieces, no gilded runners, just clean lines, light from the windows, and the hum of peace that had been absent for decades. Riley moved around it carefully, setting each plate with practiced attention. Her hair fell over her face as she leaned, but Carolyn caught the small smile tugging her lips. A girl making a home. The first knock came from Marta, carrying a tray of biscuits wrapped in a towel. Behind her trailed two neighbors from the community center and Dale, his scarf tucked into his coat. Briefcase for once left at home. Their laughter carried in with them, the sound swelling the condo until it felt larger than its walls. Marta stopped in the doorway, biscuits steaming in her hands. Her gaze swept the room, the table, the people gathering. Her eyes softened, mouth quirking into something warm. "This feels like peace," she said simply. Carolyn, adjusting silverware, looked up. Her voice was steady, low, but filled with something she hadn't heard in her own tone for years: satisfaction. It's what respect looks like, finally. They ate slowly, not rushing through the plates, but savoring each bite. Stories surfaced: Daniel's old jokes, Riley's sketches, Marta's endless collection of neighborhood gossip. At one point, Riley pulled her guitar from its case and strummed a quiet melody, not a performance this time. Just background for a family that had chosen itself. Carolyn sat back, watching, her hand resting on the smooth oak. The table seemed to breathe with them, holding not just plates, but decades of hurt, of rebuilding, of survival, of arrival here. When the meal was over, when coffee was poured, and the laughter had softened into content silence, Carolyn excused herself briefly. She returned with a leather-bound journal, the one she'd kept since Daniel's passing. She opened it to a blank page, uncapped her pen, and began to write. "Legacy is what you leave standing after you're gone." She paused, then underlined the word standing. The words looked back at her with weight and clarity. She closed the book, slid it beside her plate, and smiled to herself. It was Riley who moved last. As the plates were being gathered, she carefully set an extra one at the far end of the table. No one asked, not at first. She laid the fork just so, folded the napkin, and then reached into her sketch pad. From between the pages, she pulled a worn index card. Faded handwriting scrawled in Daniel's steady hand. She slipped it under the empty plate. Carolyn's throat tightened. She recognized it instantly. Her old holiday recipe card, Daniel's favorite. Riley must have found it tucked among the things she'd moved from the house. The girl looked up, her eyes meeting her grandmother's. Someone should always have a place here, even if it's just a memory. Carolyn reached across, touching Riley's wrist, her hand trembling with love. Around them, conversation hushed, letting the moment breathe. The empty place setting glowed in the winter light, not absence but respect. Later, after the dishes were done and the guests had left, Carolyn lingered in the dining room. The house was quiet again, the table bare except for the extra plate, the recipe card still resting beneath it. She placed her palm against the oak, feeling its strength. "At Christmas," she whispered, her voice firm, remembering that night a year ago my son said, "She shouldn't even be at the table." Her hand pressed harder, as though claiming the wood itself. "So I took the table and left him standing.